Our relationship, I think at that point, things were coming down on us pretty hard, and we started to take care of each other a lot more.
Yeah. We did 72 of those shows.
For years, television had one rule that nobody dared to break: never let the guests upstage the network. But in the winter of 1967, two brothers from San Jose walked onto a CBS soundstage with a guitar, a bass, and a habit of talking over each other, and they broke that rule on live national television. What looked like a blooper, a stumble, an accident of comic timing, was not an accident at all. Look closely at the footage today and you can see it, a joke that was never supposed to survive the censors, delivered anyway, in front of 40 million people. This is the story of how a mistake on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour became one of the most quietly rebellious moments in the history of American television, and how that single act of defiance eventually cost two brothers their entire show. Stay with us, because the full story is stranger, and far more deliberate, than the headlines ever let on. Before they were a target of the Nixon administration, Tom and Dick Smothers were just two boys from a broken home. Their father, Thomas B. Smothers, Jr., was a U.S. Army officer captured by Japanese forces early in World War II. He survived the Bataan Death March, only to die when the ship transferring him between prisoner-of-war camps was struck by friendly fire. Tom was 5. Dick was 3. Their mother raised them largely on her own, and the two brothers grew up leaning on each other in a way that would later become the entire premise of their act. One brother, endlessly patient and reasonable; the other, endlessly needy and combative, forever whining the line that would define them: "Mom always liked you best." They found their way to San Jose State University, then to the stage of San Francisco's Purple Onion, a small basement club that had already launched the Kingston Trio and Phyllis Diller. It was there, almost by accident, that the Smothers Brothers discovered their format. They had started as a folk act, guitar and upright bass, playing it straight. But when Tom began fumbling his lines, forgetting lyrics, and getting genuinely irritated when Dick corrected him, audiences laughed harder at the bickering than at the songs. The mistake became the act. By the early 1960s, they were touring nationally, releasing comedy albums, and building a reputation as clean-cut, likable performers, exactly the kind of act a nervous network executive would trust with a primetime slot. That trust mattered more than most viewers realized. In 1967, CBS was losing a ratings war it could not afford to lose. NBC's Bonanza had dominated the Sunday night 9 p.m. slot for years, and CBS had already burned through several failed attempts to compete with it. Desperate, and reasoning that two clean-cut folk comedians posed little risk, CBS handed the Smothers Brothers a variety show and, crucially, a level of creative control that was almost unheard of for performers still in their 20s. It was a bet that a wholesome-looking act would deliver wholesome, safe television. CBS had no idea what it was actually buying. Hold on to that detail, because it will matter a great deal before this video is over. What the network didn't fully grasp was that Tom Smothers, in particular, had spent the mid-1960s absorbing the counterculture bubbling up around him. He surrounded the show with a young, largely unknown writing staff: Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, Albert Brooks, Bob Einstein, Don Novello, and later Lorne Michaels, most of them years away from the fame that would follow. He booked musical guests no other variety show would touch. In its first season alone, the show became the first American network broadcast to air promotional films for the Beatles' Hey Jude and Revolution, at a time when most of America still only knew the band from grainy news footage of screaming teenagers. Then came the folk singer nobody expected to see on network television again. Pete Seeger had been blacklisted from commercial broadcasting since 1950, one of the most visible casualties of the era's anti-communist purges. When Seeger appeared on the show's Season 2 premiere in September 1967, it was his first appearance on network commercial television in 17 years. He performed a song called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy, a Vietnam-era parable about a platoon leader who marches his men deeper and deeper into a rising river, insisting the water isn't dangerous, right up until it drowns him. CBS's censors cut the segment entirely before it aired, unwilling to let the song's final verse, the one that made its target unmistakable, reach American living rooms. Seeger wasn't allowed to perform the song again on the show until months later, deep in the season, when the controversy had cooled just enough for CBS to let it through. That was the pattern that would define the next 2 years. A joke, a song, a sketch would slip past the censors or fail to, and each time it did, both the audience and the network learned a little more about how far these two brothers were willing to push. This is only the beginning of what got cut, and what came later would put the brothers directly in the crosshairs of the President of the United States. By 1968, the Comedy Hour was no longer just a variety show that occasionally pushed its luck. It had become one of the loudest countercultural voices allowed inside a mainstream American living room, at the exact moment America was tearing itself apart over Vietnam. The show booked The Who for a performance that ended in genuine, unscripted chaos. The band's usual instrument-smashing finale rigged with concealed smoke powder inside the drum kit, which detonated with far more force than anyone anticipated, damaging Pete Townshend's hearing and leaving Tom Smothers visibly shaken on camera, joking weakly about needing to borrow a bass guitar while stagehands checked for injuries. It aired anyway. So did The Doors. So did Jefferson Airplane. So did guest slots for Joan Baez and Harry Belafonte, both of whom used their airtime to make explicitly political statements CBS never would have approved from an in-house writer. The network's response was to tighten its grip. At the start of the 1968-69 season, CBS ordered the brothers to deliver finished episodes 10 full days before air date, giving the censors ample time to remove anything they judged unacceptable. In the season premiere alone, CBS cut an entire segment of Harry Belafonte singing against footage of police violence at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, along with 2 lines mocking the network's own hit show Bonanza. A sermon by comedian David Steinberg, structured as a mock religious lecture on Moses and the burning bush, was fought over so intensely that Steinberg's Moses bits became a recurring flashpoint every time he returned to the show. The brothers did not simply accept these cuts quietly. They began doing exactly what the trivia around the show would later confirm, turning in their tapes as late as possible, sometimes only hours before broadcast, calculating that the closer to airtime a segment arrived, the less time CBS's censors would have to excise it. It was a small, repeatable act of institutional sabotage, hiding in plain sight inside a deadline, but the most disturbing part of this story is still ahead, and it changes everything we thought we knew about why this show was really cancelled. Here is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This was never really a fight about taste, or lateness, or missed deadlines. It was a fight about who controlled the American living room during a war that had already killed tens of thousands of draft-age men. Consider the layers of pressure stacked on top of one another by early 1969. First, the show had landed the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, a spot on President Richard Nixon's now notorious list of political enemies, a designation reserved for people the administration considered threats worth tracking. Second, CBS News itself resented the show, according to writer-producer Saul Ilson, who said the news division felt the Comedy Hour was invading its territory by doing serious political commentary inside a comedy format. Third, local affiliate stations across the country, many in conservative church-going markets, were independently cutting or refusing to air segments they found too controversial, creating a patchwork of censorship even after CBS's own edits. Fourth, and perhaps most tellingly, Tom Smothers had begun lobbying the FCC and members of Congress directly, publicly framing CBS's editing decisions as corporate censorship rather than ordinary standards enforcement, taking the fight outside the building and into the halls of government. Each of these pressures alone might have been survivable. Together, they made the brothers a liability no amount of ratings could offset, and the ratings, it's worth noting, were never the problem. The show remained a top 10 hit through its final season. Stay with us, because what happened next didn't just end a television show. It ended an era of trust between CBS and 2 performers the network had once bet its entire Sunday night on. The breaking point came in early 1969. On March 9th, CBS aired a rerun instead of a new episode. The previous new episode had featured Joan Baez, whose husband was in prison for draft resistance, dedicating a song to him on air. Weeks later, the network learned the brothers intended to feature a new irreverent Steinberg monologue on an episode scheduled to air around Easter, material CBS considered especially inflammable given the religious calendar. On April 4, 1969, CBS network president Robert Wood pulled the plug. The official reason given to the press was simple and almost bureaucratic. The Smothers Brothers had failed once again to deliver a finished episode by the network's mandated pre-air deadline, this time missing it entirely rather than merely cutting it close. Almost nobody who followed the show believed that was the real reason, and neither did the man who made the call. Wood himself later said it had become clear the brothers were unwilling to accept the standards of taste CBS had established. The show had, in fact, just been renewed for a 4th season 2 weeks earlier, and had already sold more than 90% of its advertising inventory for the year ahead. A show that profitable, that close to guaranteed renewal, does not get killed over a shipping delay. It gets killed because the people who own the airwaves decide the fight is no longer worth the ratings. This is where the story lands on the moment that gives this video its name, the blooper that fans still argue over decades later. Watch the surviving footage from those final months closely and you'll notice something strange. Several of the show's most pointed jokes were delivered with a stumble, a mistimed cutaway, a line stepped on before the punchline could land cleanly, the exact stagecraft the brothers had built their entire act around since their days at the Purple Onion. Except by 1969, that stumble was doing double duty. A flubbed line, corrected in the moment with a knowing look at the camera, could smuggle a joke past a live studio audience and a control room full of censors who were braced for something else entirely. What looked like an unpolished blooper was, in several documented instances, the brothers' oldest trick, brotherly bickering as comic camouflage, repurposed as a delivery system for material CBS had already tried to cut. The mistake wasn't a mistake. It was the format working exactly as designed, just aimed at a different target than the one CBS's censors were watching for. The human cost of all this often gets lost in the legal and political framing. Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, and Lorne Michaels were still years from the fame that would define their careers. For them, the Comedy Hour's final season was the loss of the first writing room that had ever taken their instincts seriously. Pete Seeger, finally allowed back onto network television after 17 years in the wilderness, watched his most pointed verse get cut before it could reach the very audience it was written for. And the brothers themselves, 31 and 29 years old at the time of cancellation, went from hosting one of the top 10 shows on American television to unemployed almost overnight, despite having just sold 90% of a season's advertising space that would now never air. The worst part of this story, in one sense, is still ahead. Because winning didn't mean getting their show back. The brothers sued. On April 6, 1973, 4 years after the cancellation, a federal court ruled decisively in their favor, finding that CBS had breached its contract and ordering the network to pay the brothers roughly $776,000, a figure worth well over $5 million today. It was, by any legal measure, a total vindication. The ruling established a lasting precedent that a network could not manufacture a technical pretext to cancel a show it simply no longer wanted to defend politically. Tom Smothers himself downplayed the money decades later, telling the Associated Press the payout was minor by dollar terms but that the principle was the entire point. And yet the legal win did not restore what had been lost. CBS filled the Sunday night slot with Hee Haw, a cornpone variety show built around the safest possible version of rural American comedy. No politics, no protest folk singers, no confrontations with censors, and it ran successfully for 23 seasons, far longer than the Comedy Hour itself had lasted. The brothers got a second chance on ABC in 1970 with a short 9-episode run, then again on NBC in 1975 with a tamer, unsuccessful revival, and again on CBS itself in 1988. None of them recaptured the show's original charge. The lesson underneath all of it was uncomfortable. Audiences had cheered the fight while it was happening, but when given the choice between provocative television and safe, uncomplicated entertainment, millions of them simply changed the channel to the cornfield. But the story doesn't end in defeat, because something about what the brothers built refused to disappear. The show's real afterlife lived in the people who passed through its writer's room. Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, Albert Brooks, and Lorne Michaels all went on to reshape American comedy in the decade that followed, and Michaels in particular would go on to build Saturday Night Live, a show that inherited the Comedy Hour's willingness to use satire as a weapon against sitting presidents, this time with a network that had learned, at great cost to a competitor, exactly how much audiences were willing to tolerate. In 2022, the Smothers family donated their archive, contracts, depositions, scripts, and press clippings documenting the entire censorship fight, to the UC Santa Barbara Library, an institution that compared the collection's significance to material typically housed at the Library of Congress. Performers and creators from Gary Trudeau to Matt Groening have cited the brothers as a direct influence on their own willingness to use mainstream platforms for pointed political commentary. So here's the real question this story leaves behind. Two brothers built an entire career out of the appearance of mistakes, a fumbled line, a forgotten lyric, a joke that seemed to slip out sideways, and then when the stakes became a war that was killing their own generation, they weaponized that same appearance of accident to say things a straight delivery never would have survived. They won their lawsuit. They proved their case. And they still lost their platform, while the safest, least controversial show on television ran for over 2 decades in the slot they used to hold. What does that trade tell us about what American television, and American audiences, were actually willing to fight for in 1969, and what, if anything, has really changed since? Do you think the Smothers brothers could have kept their platform if they'd fought CBS more quietly, or was the collision with the network always inevitable the moment they started telling the truth on a Sunday night? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation truly belongs to all of us. And if this story moved you, Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives like this one.